start off by saying thank you, everyone, for coming to the last talk. I'm really proud to be in a room with so many great intellectuals and amongst all ages and professions and levels of profession. Right, so my talk is Whose Lane Is It Anyway? I wanted to have something punny because I think that in academia we can be quite dry most of the time. And a lot of you think that I'm just a cyclist, but I also think that cyclists can be suppressed in cities just as everyone can be suppressed in their own way. And I think that narration, as we've been talking about throughout this whole day, is a very important way to send a message out to people, and in terms of how we think about disseminating our research. And as Brett said, you know, we can use GIS data to plot something, but what is the plot? So I'm going to just play a video that I created by strapping a GoPro onto my helmet and going around Waterloo and interviewing a few people and narrating it with my own voices. You may learn. Enjoy. I'm gonna set the lights down low, make it all moody.
I was 7 years old and my sister was 9. We were outside of our house on an empty paved road in the middle of the suburbs of Toronto. My sister had a pink bike and she had me saddle the bar below the seat, holding onto the handlebars as she rode. After getting the hang of it, I graduated to seat level and rode the bike on my own. I felt like I was flying, or at least rolling down a suburban street with no cars to get in my way. It felt amazing. Cycling has become a big part of my life. I ride with friends, family, for transportation, and simply to escape. Sometimes it's hard to enjoy cycling because I'm constantly dodging traffic. Sometimes it's like I'm swimming with sharks. Cycling-friendly policies are made to keep cyclists safe, but do they actually do this? Or is it just a road for cars where cyclists seem to be getting caught in the crossfire? This so-called cycle-friendly city, where cars reign supreme, needs to be critiqued.
That. Now I'm going to be talking about how stories clearly move people. Narrative inquiry can be used because it has this descriptive quality to it to gather rich, informed data. But what about people who move? See what I did there? City cycling has been gaining momentum for decades. However, it's become a problem for public officials and planners, and we need to plan city cycling effectively. We have all these benefits to city cycling that we need to focus on. Firstly, healthcare is maybe the obvious one. Through physical fitness, we can use preventative measures to decrease the amount of chronic diseases and take pressure off the healthcare system. Taking pressure off the healthcare system relates to the economic values in which the city has, because it's not spending so much on healthcare. There's also some stoppage time. I use this term lightly because going down a street at 60 kilometers an hour versus 20 kilometers an hour, you find it much harder to stop at, oh, there's a sign there, I'm gonna stop at that shop, go in, lock my bike, and just take something, buy something from a local shop, versus driving down this aimless street not really having a face. Thirdly, the environmental benefit is extremely important because not only are we talking about fossil fuels of cars, that's obvious, but we're talking about the increased fossil fuels from road construction, from highways, from houses being built in suburbs upon suburb, and just driving until you qualify, not really thinking about how we're planning our cities for active transportation, to use the term lightly. But lastly, I want to touch upon the cultural aspects of cycling, because personally, when I ride a bike, I feel as though I'm part of something bigger than myself. And I have the ability to stop at a stoplight and say hi to the cyclist riding beside me, rather than if you're in a car, you can't just say, honk your horn and say, hey, how's it going? It's a pretty nice day outside. People are like, what do you want from me? And really, really stressed out. You can tell I don't like driving as much. Oops. Next, I want to talk about the gaps in the literature. The gaps. So qualitative research is seldom used to study cycling, as we've used GIS data to capture multi-purpose spaces and how many cyclists are driving or cycling down a road, and we say, okay, well, 3 cyclists go down per hour. We don't need anything for them. We don't need a bike lane. We don't need to segregate this. There's just 3 people, but it doesn't capture the people that aren't in the bike lane, and that's what I aim to do with my research. Secondly, narrative inquiry is obviously, as I've explained, not used as much in quantitative research for cycling. And lastly, what I want to focus on now is critical urban theory used for studying city cycling. I'm going to talk a little bit more about critical urban theory, as theory informs research. So critical urban theory aims to critique these divisions of power and this dominant discourse of car culture in our cities. Marcuse, specifically Marcuse 2009, talks about these 3 steps of expose, propose, and politicize in order to induce any change in a city. And he critiques this neoliberal city and says, well, we have people who want to make money from the car industry, and we have cyclists who won't make that money for us. And this is a free market economy, and we're going to leave it up to people to take up their own cycling and their own leisure, yet not create these spaces for them and the accessibility at a government level. So I want to touch upon the active transportation bit, because walking is the #1 leisure activity for Canadians, yet second to walking is cycling. And active transportation, on the other hand, is only 3% of Canadians. So are we, in this neoliberal sense, dividing leisure cyclists and active transportation cyclists to trivialize this whole larger group, which is actually much bigger than we sought it out to be? So, a few things that I'm thinking about with this research. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to expose how that normalization of car culture suppresses cyclists within the city, and specifically within the city of Waterloo, with the intent to form that policy. The research questions are on how cycling policies or cycling-friendly policies actually privilege car culture. So it's one thing to say, okay, what is the culture of cycling, and how are we accommodating cyclists? But what the real meat of the question is that I want to get at, and why I'm using critical urban theory, is to be critical of these cycle-friendly policies and say, well, how are we not actually accommodating for cyclists? We say that we are. We have 800 kilometers of bike lanes. We are the biggest cycle-friendly city in the world, but not actually cycle-friendly. This leads me to the methodology that I've talked oh so great about as narrative inquiry. I'm going to build counter stories, which are going to be composite narratives from cyclists, and I'm going to use testimonio as one of my methods because it's a collaboration of life history and life story. So for example, in my video, I talked about the first time that I learned to ride a bike and how it was meaningful for me. And then I went on to talk about sometimes I don't feel like in the city I'm actually planned for, and people just want to theoretically and figuratively push me over to the side of the road. This is really important because it shows how cycling is important for people and then why they're actually not being able to do this thing that they find so meaningful and important in their day-to-day lives. Also, through the recruitment phase, I'm going to go to different bicycle shops and talk to a whole range of people that I've already been speaking to over Facebook and just even Waterloo Cycling Club, and how we're talking about reasons and places within the city that they've nearly been hit by a car, or that they have been hit by a car, or they know someone who has, or their friend died, and you know, these areas of the city, even ghost bikes, and that's why it's really important to capture the stories because they don't get captured in a quantitative analysis of bikers on the road. Also, I'd like to point out that I'm going to be capturing all different types of cyclists. So let's say on a bike rack where people lock up their bikes, I'll put a sign saying, would you like to change cycling policy in Waterloo? And therefore, people who aren't necessarily parts of these clubs or see themselves as an avid cyclist, but really want to change cycling in a positive manner, yet don't know how to do it, have the ability to do so with this research. This leads me to the analysis and representation. Again, I'm going to create and contextualize these counter stories and within this larger meta-narrative of car-dominant discourse. The aim is to expose, in the first phase of Marcuse's expose, politicize, expose, propose, and politicize. And I understand that this is master's research, so within the scope of this MA thesis, I'm only going to be focusing on expose. This is because in my doctoral research, I plan to explore more about how to propose planning for the city and how to politicize this within the larger scope of things. These are just a few examples of how cycling research has been disseminated, and it's vast. I mean, cycling has been taken up by the Critical Mass, which is a huge organization throughout the world who has millions of members all dedicated to the advocacy of cycling. One Less Car is a great book by Zach Furness, who's at Penn State, and he does a lot of research on cycling, yet the book makes so much money because it uses lay language and terms that are accessible for all audiences. There's the Bicycle Film Festival in London, Bikes versus Cars, which is one of my personal favorites that played at Princess Cinema, and different urban bikeway transportation guidelines for cities to be able to use. And the telltale question of so what? This is used, I think, in our faculty a lot, but it's very important, and it is a term that is easy to understand, yet really hard to capture. And me and my fake photo of Abbey Road, I photoshopped the bike lane in there because I think it's important. But I want to end off on a story that I think is really, really paramount to this literature, and it's by John Lennon. As a kid, I had a dream. I wanted to own my own bike. When I got the bike, I must have been the happiest boy in Liverpool, maybe the world. I lived for that bike. Most kids left their bike in their backyard at night. Not me. I insisted to take mine indoors, and the first night, I even kept it in my bed.